let's explain to us what Monk means when he calls he uses the term identity synthesis. This is his term for the woke mentality, and then also talk about the rise of all these new academic centers and departments that are focused on questions of identity.
Well, I mean, what Monk does not, none of these authors discuss, really flesh out what they mean by woke ideology. And so, what Monk means is the identity synthesis is kind of intersectionality to some extent. It's this hyper focus on the nature of one's identity, and then building a politics out from that always returns to that. And in terms of these academic centers, you see, I mean, a lot of the books that I discussed are written by academics, and one of my critiques is that these academics perhaps overemphasize the role of academia in all of this. But there has been a rise since the 60s of these academic centers that are not departments, which is important in a number of ways. One thing that Monk doesn't talk about is that, traditionally the university was self-governing, and there has been a change since World War II where the administration has gotten bigger and bigger. There's a great book about this by Benjamin Ginsberg, who's a professor emeritus down at Johns Hopkins, and it's called The Fall of the Faculty, the Rise of the All-Administrative University. But one of the ways that the faculty, who still are, a very privileged group of workers, but much less so as our ranks, as tenure is eliminated and replaced with adjunct labor. But one of the ways that the faculty are weakened is, instead of channeling resources to departments, academic departments that are still self-governing and often kind of little democracies, contentious, often terrible places to work. Not the one I work at, which is a great place, but these centers dispense with all that bureaucracy. You don't have like faculty voting on hires, faculty voting on curriculum changes. These centers usually are built around one charismatic individual, and they appeal to funders, and the funders have undue influence, direct influence on the content of what is going to be researched, presented to the public, etc. And what gets funded, surprise, surprise, is not working class politics, the class struggle, anti-imperialist, organizing. It is this divisive politics of ever more rarefied subsets of identity. And so that's a big part of what helps push wokeness, is because those are where the jobs are. And that's where the jobs are because that's where the money from elites is going, right? I mean, if you look at the website of the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Brother Foundation or any of these foundations, I mean, just do keyword search for social justice, right? The modern left in the United States is heavily, heavily dependent on these foundations, which are themselves the tools of the American ruling class, funded by fortunes built on the backs of coal miners and fossil fuel exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. And these foundations are not established to and are not seeking to overthrow, undo, or transform American capitalism. They are fundamentally about legitimizing and perpetuating it. And they have become very adept at using rhetoric that at first glance, you hear echoes of the 60s. At first glance, like, oh, this is quite radical. But you realize it's not. It's totally compatible with the increasingly unequal class hierarchy that is our society.
I want to ask, go ahead.
Another
no, go ahead.
Go on. Well, another material force behind all this is the law. And the last book I discussed is actually by a pretty odious right-winger, Richard Hanania, who was a self-admitted former racist. But his book, I must say, makes an interesting point. He says that a lot of that essentially woke culture is downstream from the law, specifically the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which he doesn't like and would like to get rid of. But this is the interesting part of his argument. He says it's the weakness of the law that sort of perpetuates wokeness. What's he talking about? Well, the Civil Rights Act allows for private sector enforcement in the civil courts, and it has incredibly vague parameters. For example, for some reason that I'm honestly not quite clear on, uh, hiring quotas have always been taboo in the United States. This is, I believe, Eisenhower said, when first being confronted with civil rights legislation, that in the military, that there wouldn't, as long as there weren't any quotas, right? And ever since then, maybe it was even Truman, but ever since then, this idea has stuck. But in fact, there are quotas. There are informal quotas. And so part of how you learn, part of what you learn in modern academia is this kind of lying and double standards. Anyway, so in the vagueness of this law, and it compares it to some extent with what's going on in France. In France, for example, there are certain laws against discrimination. For example, French firms have to hire a certain percentage of disabled workers. This is a quota. It's set by the labor ministry, and the labor ministry enforces it, right? In the United States, we don't have anything like that. That would be illegal. But instead, what we have is a law that says you, as a worker or consumer or person, you can sue institutions if you've been discriminated against. And so this leads to I should interrupt myself for a second. There is also enforcement of civil rights law violations by the federal government, but a lot of the enforcement is left up to the private sector. So what has happened over recent decades is that corporate America has been faced with really expensive lawsuits. You know, 100, $200 million at times by basically, like, I think it's like 95% of the Fortune 500 firms have had to pay out pretty significant damages for various types of racial and sexist discrimination, right? So what do they do to defend themselves? Well, they start investing in the the, the HR infrastructure and the outsourced HR infrastructure of diversity consultants and trainers, et cetera, et cetera. And they do this in hopes that they can, extirpate the racist and sexist managers, or at least the mentality of managers who might have those attitudes, get them to shut their mouths and stop costing the company money. But if that fails, they also have a defense. They can say, look, uh, to the court, they say, look, we invest heavily in trying to create an inclusive workspace. So that's a huge amount of money that goes to people like Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. And there's an entire industry. People make a fairly good living doing this kind of training and around these woke ideas, and inculcating also, it's not just ideas and arguments, it's a whole kind of sensibility, right? That's why it's a subculture. It's like concern with etiquette and aesthetics is absolutely important in it. And so, that's part of why corporate America, people are like, why is corporate America going through this stuff? It's like to defend themselves against lawsuits, because of the history of 95% of the Fortune 500 companies having had to pay out large damage settlements because of their bigotry, right? So they invest heavily in this private sector entrepreneurial infrastructure. And so then this cadre of experts, of course, see the need for their services everywhere. And as a result, you get certain kind of left ideas from social sciences extracted and distorted. For example, the idea of structural racism has become the notion of systemic racism. Structural racism is the idea that there are racist outcomes even when there isn't racist intent. That structures like housing markets, educational funding systems that are partly dependent on property values, how this can lead to unfair outcomes for different demographic groups, right? Systemic racism is the idea that racism is in everywhere, is everywhere and in everyone, and that everything is racist. The two sound similar: structural racism, systemic racism. What's the difference? They're actually very different. Um, so, so now this this cadre that can siphon up money not just from universities and foundations, but also from the private sector, is constantly pushing these ideas and this sensibility. And that's a very important part of where it all comes from. Another part of where it comes from, which I left out of the piece, but if I were to do it again and had more time, more space, the Obama administration plays a very important role in this. Monk notes that the mainstream press turns woke in around 2010, and that all this predates Trump. This is not just a reaction to Trump, but that the use of terms like systemic racism increases by orders of magnitude in the New York Times, usage of it in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, etc. And while he doesn't get into this, Laura Kipnis does in her book, which is not one of the books that is reviewed here, called Unwanted Advances. And that she shows how the Obama administration's interpretation of Title IX and the use of what it called Dear Colleague letters really kind of set off a kind of sex panic on campuses that 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 she documents in a critical fashion, and that's a very good book. But I think that's a very important part of the kind of explosion of woke, as well as those Obama administration Dear Colleague letters about how Title IX is to be interpreted.
Let's talk about social media, the
Oh, what?
rise.
Sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
one thing, lest it be misunderstood. So Hanania, he wants to get rid of civil rights law. That's a terrible idea. But what I argue in this piece is that the evidence he shows can be used for the exact opposite conclusion, which is that actually maybe what we need is a clearer, stronger civil rights law. We need to have a larger role for government, and maybe a discussion about quotas, since we informally have them but we deny it. And to get rid of this whole private sector entrepreneurial propulsion system for woke ideology.